Hi guys, and welcome to the 8 hallmarks of the best argument analysis pieces. And what we mean by that is the habits that the very best writers across Victoria use when they're writing an argument analysis piece on Section C in that exam. This is the third video in a series of 3. And so you should be watching this if you have watched the second video in our series about writing consistently good argument analysis pieces and you're feeling comfortable with that. If you're also at a point where you feel like you're doing well in language analysis, argument analysis, but you really want to do the things that are going to get you to those top marks, or you're a little bit frustrated because you seem to get what the argument analysis is all about, but you're just not quite accessing those absolute top marks. So I'm going to take you through 8 hallmarks of the best scoring pieces that we see and what it is that separates them from the regular, pretty good and good pieces to make them the absolute very best. And so the first habit that we're going to talk about is the idea of a purpose versus a contention. And what I mean by that is that the middle of the road pieces are the ones that can show that they understand the contention of a piece, what the writer is saying. But the ones that go beyond that and go further to really get to that sophisticated analysis are the ones that start to look at the purpose of the writer. And when we think of that term purpose, we're thinking about what the writer is looking to do. And so we start to move towards what the writer is doing throughout the article and what they want the reader to do, rather than just pointing out what they have said to them. And so on your screen at the moment, you'll be seeing the example of how this works, and where we see things like Miller challenges the reader of the piece to embrace the proposed ideas and to see what they have become. And you can see how that comes across as having a full understanding of exactly why the writer has used the language that they have and the things that they're looking to do to the person reading their piece. As opposed to the example with the contention, Miller contends that this is a needed change and that people should adopt it. So if we take a look at the difference between them, one is pointing out what the writer has said and shows that they understand the article, and the other one has gone on to talk about what the writer is doing through their language and shows that they have a holistic understanding of exactly why the writer has done what they have. There's a second example there, and down the bottom you can see Canty states that people are not living their full life and that they are capable of more. And that's just an outlining of a contention. It's not really wrong, but as you would understand by the title of this video, it's not about whether we're getting things right. It's about doing things at the absolute best level that we can. And so a level up from that will look like Canty aims to inspire his reader to see their potential, whilst also encouraging them to want more for themselves as they get involved with his program. And so if you can make this a habit of your work, particularly in the introduction, you're going to show that you are moving beyond just the regular old analysis of argument and language, that you're actually really engaging and understanding the full purpose of why the writer has done all the things that they have done, rather than just showing that you understand what they have said. Second habit and the second hallmark of the absolute best pieces that we see are the students that consider the audience throughout the entire piece. And what I mean by this is the students that are allowing the audience of the piece to colour all of the analysis that they put forward. They don't simply mention that there's a specific audience at the start in their introduction and then just move on and write the rest of the analysis, oblivious to that fact, but rather they are always considering that every little thing that the writer has done has been done to impact that particular audience, and that their analysis will come through not just as a bland, this word will make people feel like this, or this picture will make people feel like that. It actually comes across as considering that the audience is this particular group of people, the language will impact them in that way. And it can be a real separator again between the students who show somewhat of an understanding of how language works to the students who understand the intricacies of how specific language comes across to impact a specific audience, and how important that is when we really want to fully understand the operation of language in an analysis. And so the example that we have there on the screen, having reassured the retirees that he understands their plight, Masood then lays out his plan with a reference to old-fashioned values. And so a couple of things that come out there. He's looking to reassure the retirees. So if we consider retirees as a segment of our society, people that are looking for reassurance and looking for some surety, then that's showing that real example of understanding how the writer has looked to impact them. And then when we have this idea of old-fashioned values, that's an understanding that that language has been used because he knows that it's going to impact his specific audience directly. Habit number 3, and the hallmark that we're looking for here is a student that can often group their evidence. And what I mean by that is that a student who will take a quote from the beginning of the piece and put it together with a quote from midway through the piece and put them together to show an analysis of how that language has worked together in order to aid the overall purpose of the writer. This can also come about when an analysis looks at elements of the visual that are there and composes an analysis that looks at those elements of the visual along with specific elements of language and puts them together for that analysis. It just shows an overall holistic understanding of how languages worked throughout the piece and shows that overall purpose that we spoke about earlier, as opposed to a student who might be doing a really good job of analysing language, but is instead just chronologically working through the piece and writing things along the lines of Smith then does that, and then he does that, and then he does that, and then he does that. If we take a look at our example here, we have Makosi's concession that he doesn't fully understand, coupled with his later claim that he is willing to learn, allow the reader to view him as. So I want you to picture this sample sentence here as if that first quote of doesn't fully understand may have been, say, in the second paragraph, and then the willing to learn quote may have come from the second last paragraph. And how just in a subtle way, the assessor reading this piece is going to see that this student has a holistic understanding of how language has shifted, how argument has shifted, and how this writer has looked to use language throughout the piece to make a similar point. We can see with the second one here, readers are moved to draw links between the pig-headed character from Young's visual to the rude ingrate that he encounters in the shopping centre as he paints younger members of the community as. So that example where we're looking at an element of the picture, pretending that there is a pig-headed character in the visual, and then looking at a quote that described a pig-headed sort of individual and putting them together to show how the visual complements the language that's there. It's not just a standalone thing that's been analysed on its own. And so what you also might want to take from that is some of the language use and the structure that's there. Having a quote and then following it with coupled with another quote is just a nice, sophisticated, clean, easy way of putting two pieces of evidence together to get to that holistic understanding of language. Habit number 4 is a student that will always be focused on verbs. And now this really falls in line with the very first habit that we talked about purpose. That if I want you to be showing that you understand the purpose of language and what a writer is trying to do to the reader, well then I need you to be using doing words. And so often a separator between a pretty good analysis and the very best analysis is the student that is constantly coming back to using verbs to show that they understand the operation and the function of language. So ask yourself, does the writer challenge the reader? Do they confront them? Do they encourage them? Do they inspire them? It's about going further than just emotion. I want to know what that emotion does. So we won't want to be just talking about this language is used and then the person is made to feel guilty, or this person is made to feel sad or made to feel happy or whatever it might be. We want to get to the point where we're really looking at what that language does. Whether the reader is confronted by the language, whether the reader is challenged, and all of these types of verbs. You'll notice that as you start to do this with more and more practice pieces, it can become a habit that you can lay out there, and you'll start to annotate your pieces. And as you're reading, you'll start having bells go off in your head thinking, wow, this is where they've started to challenge them, or this is where they've confronted them, or this is where they've supported them, or this is where they're sympathetic to them. All of these different things will come across, and when you start to include that in your own analysis, you're starting to get to those habits of the very best ones. Habit number 5, and it's the word multiple. And I want you to consider this as a way of improving what you already have on your page. Ask yourself, have you considered multiple audiences? There are always going to be more than one specific audience that are going to be reading a piece. There might be specific audiences mentioned in the background information, or there might be different people that are reading the piece. Say, for example, if it's one of the last exam pieces and it's about people in a town, you might be talking about the younger people versus the elderly citizens of the town and how different audiences will react in different ways. It's a really great strategy to use for you to be able to show a deeper level of insight, that you understand that specific language will operate differently on specific audiences and that a piece can have more than one intended audience. Also with that, we should also be looking at multiple impacts. So often students write these really long paragraphs and they can write really clearly and really beautifully and really well, but they're setting up for this analysis by including all this great evidence and showing that they understand what the writer has done. And then when it comes time to talk about the analysis, what we're here for in this area of study, they'll write something like, "This leads the reader to feel aggravated," and then they move on to something else. By the time you get to that analysis, that's the time to really show how many different ways the language can impact on someone. We want to see multiple impacts of language. We don't want to work ourselves up to that analysis only to just say, and it does one thing, and then we'll move on. So look to layer your analysis. I've included an example here where you can see that it says, Smith aims to embolden low-income earners that are reading his piece through his depiction of them as the backbone of our workforce and the fabric of our society. Through such appreciative language, business owners or higher income workers are also given time to consider the work of others and how they benefit from those around them. And so there's a few things going on here. There's of course that idea of the low income earners that are reading the piece being emboldened by the language. And then there are the higher income earners and business owners appreciating the efforts of other people. So it's considered multiple audiences. And there's also those multiple impacts of language. It looks to embolden people. People are also given time to consider the work of others and to appreciate. And so in those 2 or 3 sentences that we've got there, we've got 2 audiences and 3 different impacts of language, all packed into those 2 sentences, so that this analysis is just constantly working towards the different ways that language and argument can make an impact on different people in different ways. Habit number 6, and we've titled this one the From Here to There strategy. And what I mean by this is that it can be a sophisticated way for you to show your overall understanding of language by including paragraphs that show that a writer will move a group of people to a certain feeling or a certain emotion, and once they've got them there, they can then do something else to them. It's a little trick, and once you start seeing it being done in certain pieces, you'll realize how easy it is to include in your analysis. But when you do it well, it really comes off as an effective, high-end sort of analysis. And you can see with the example there, we've written, by assuring them that their superannuation is completely safe, Morris then moves to encourage his older readers to be more aggressive in their outlook. And so that is a really sophisticated understanding of language, because it's showing that Morris has moved these people to feel sure and confident so that he can then make them feel that they should be more aggressive in their investing outlook or whatever it might be. It's about showing that you understand that writers will do many things to a reader, and that a lot of times writers will set up a reader to then get them to a point so that they can then do something else to them. And so that way we're getting those multiple impacts of language again, and not just that basic this language equals this feeling over and over and over again. The second example we have there, having outlined the enormous risk that some may be taking should they choose the wrong option, Bowman positions himself as the steadying voice of reason and a trusted source of help for the audience. And so you'll see how the language use allows us to write this more in-depth and sophisticated analysis. When we have words like by assuring them or having outlined the enormous risk, it's a strategy and a trick that you can get used to in your own writing that'll lead you to be really analytical, really insightful, and really clear and succinct in the way in which you analyze. By getting the reader to this certain point, the writer can then do this to them. And it's that overall understanding of language and how it works. The 7th example that we've talked about is looking at insight. And whilst this might not so much be of a strategy, it's about the separation between the good language analysis pieces and the best language analysis pieces. And this is one of those things that your teacher can say to you when they're talking about what you can do to improve, that you need to be more insightful. But how do we do that? The way in which you're going to be able to do that is to look through the last few years of the exam in the section C and to ask yourself, what are the little things that perhaps not everybody will notice? If you think about the people that write this exam, they have to write a piece that is open for students who might struggle a little bit with this area, that is then accessible for most students across the state, but also includes some tiny little things and those nuanced little arguments that not every student will pick up upon. And if you're watching this video, it means that you're aiming to be one of those very top students, so be aware of that. Don't just dwell in the obvious. Don't deal in only the stuff that everybody can see. Of course, you are going to have to deal with the main arguments that everyone's going to have to deal with. You can't ignore them, but you've got to make sure that you're actually asking yourself, what are the little things that have been done here that I'm picking up on that I don't think most other people would? It sounds easy, but it's a habit that you need to find yourself working in, because the really best analysis pieces aren't just doing better with the stuff that everybody can see, they're also picking up on the little things that perhaps not everybody else across the state can pick up on. If you're finding this difficult, take a look through some sample pieces of really high-end work of the last 3 or 4 years of the Section C and notice all of the little things that have been picked up on that you think, oh, probably not everyone would have picked up on that, and then challenge yourself to be incorporating that into any practice work that you complete. And so our last hallmark of the highest scoring pieces is to make sure that we have fluent, cohesive, and controlled writing. And so what I mean by that is making sure that your language use is allowing you to be analytical, allowing you to be sophisticated, and doing so in a way that stands out from the others. And whilst this might be something that some of you might feel you either have or you don't have, there are many tricks that you can use. And sometimes what students are held back by are the acronyms or the formulas or the structures that they are taught in class. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here by having people think that I don't like these structures or anything like that. I've taught them myself and I see the value in them, but the very top students aren't sticking to a basic formula or structure. You might have used something along the lines of TEA, topic, evidence analysis, argument, EEA, whatever acronym it might be, or what, how, why, so. All of them have their place and they all have value. But if you are aiming to be in that very top bracket of students, you need to realize that those students are not adhering to those structures in a really rigid manner. That sometimes their analysis might begin with the evidence first. Sometimes it might begin with the impact of the argument, or sometimes it might begin with the outline of the argument. But it varies the language use. It means that as the assessor's reading through it, they're not just reading a paint by numbers analysis that always says, this was the argument, here's a few quotes that show the argument, and now I've put a couple of emotions and feelings in at the end, and now I've just repeated that 6 times and written 6 short paragraphs. Rather, the language use is varied and it has a bit of vibrancy and a bit of life to it, because the first paragraph opens up and it talks about the argument to start with, and then it goes on to layer some evidence and talks about multiple audiences and then gets onto multiple impacts of language. The second paragraph actually begins with the analysis first by saying something like, the readers are confronted when Smith goes on to, whatever it might be. And it varies the language use so that the piece has a life to it and a sense of control in the writing. Again, the best way for you to see this happening is to ask your teacher for sample pieces of the very best work that they've had in the last few years, and try to emulate what those high scoring students have done before you. That doesn't mean plagiarizing the words that they have used, but rather steal some of the sentence structures or some of the terms and verbs and adjectives that they use when they're describing language and start to make them your own. You can also do that by checking out our videos that we'll have for the last few years of the VCE exam, and the videos where we've outlined the very highest scoring pieces and seeing some of the language analysis that's there. So guys, that's everything for today's video. If there's still any questions that you might have, feel free to put them down there in the comments. Give us a thumbs up or a like if you've got something out of today's video, and subscribe to the channel so you can be kept up to date with all of our future advice for the other areas of study as well. Until next time, all the best and good luck.